We will continue our study of Proverbs 4 through 9 in overview fashion with point 3, thematic patterns in Proverbs 4 to 9. When one studies the themes of reprimand, body behavior, and influential women in their recurring sequence, they display a measure of patterning. Later on, we'll consider whether this pattern may follow a progression of thought. Once again, I'd like to refer you to the outline that you see displayed before you now, and let's walk through the various poems in series and notice how they flow. Poem 1, opening chapter 4, serves as an introduction, and it samples all three of the themes: reprimand, body behavior, and influential women. This can be titled, Above All Else, Acquire Wisdom. After this introduction, we come to a cycle of 3 poems, numbers 2, 3, and 4, which move first through theme A, reprimand, and then theme B, a positive approach to body behavior, and then theme C, which speaks to influential women, and both positive and negative individuals are presented here. Those titles then, continuing in sequence, are as follows. For poem 2, cling to the route of discipline by exiting the route of the guilty. Poem 3, for life and health, train your body in forthright behaviors. And poem 4, avoid the enslaving foreign woman. Instead, delight in your wife and find fruitfulness. Beginning with poem 5, there's a cluster which I'm designating cycle number 2, extending through poem 10. These move through first theme A, which is reprimand, and then 2 poems devoted to theme B, body behavior, both of them negative in orientation, and then 3 poems devoted to theme C, having to do with influential women. The first of those 3, that is poem 8, samples both women. Poem 9 concentrates primarily on the negative female figure, and poem 10 on the positive female character. Those respective titles then, back to poem 5, are as follows. You snared yourself, escape. Then poem 6, beware the behaviors of the worthless. Poem 7, beware the behaviors of the loathsome. Poem 8, prize the protectress, beware the huntress. Poem 9, beware the lethal seductress. And poem 10, have you considered woman wisdom's offer? Poem 11 operates as a conclusion and samples all 3 themes. It encompasses chapter 9 and can be entitled, Whose Invitation Will You Accept? Lady Wisdom's or Dame Folly's? From a cursory glance, 2 observations emerge. First, the threefold sequence of themes that is initiated in cycle 1 repeats itself in cycle 2, but with more numerous representation. Thus, cycle 1 gives a preview, while cycle 2 provides expansion. Within cycle 2, theme A, that is the theme dealing with reprimand, this presents a single poem, that is poem number 5, while theme B, that is body behavior, this presents 2 poems, namely number 6 and number 7. And when we reach theme C regarding influential women, we find in cycle 2 a series of 3 poems, numbers 8, 9, and 10. A second observation involves the opening and closing poems, that is numbers 1 and 11. These are noteworthy since they combine all 3 themes to a lesser or greater degree. Consider first how each of the 3 themes functions in poem 1. From its opening line, that first poem impresses on readers the importance of theme A, that is reprimand, by selecting a synonym of reprimand for the initial exhortation. It reads, and we're now drawing from chapter 4, verse 1, Listen, my sons, to a father's discipline. A couple of lines later, the grandfather shapes his opening exhortation around theme B, that is body behavior. And here we're drawing from chapter 4, verse 4. The grandfather exhorts, may your mind take hold of my words. The fact that the word mind occupies the chief rank among other body parts, the grandfather is going to clarify in a later poem, particularly chapter 4, verse 23, when he says, against every imprisonment, protect your mind, for from it spring life's initiatives. In poem number 1, theme C, that is influential women, operates not through named characters, but more subtly through feminine pronouns and verbs, such as this from chapter 4, sampling verses 6, 8, and 9. We read, do not abandon her so she may guard you. Notice the pronominal reference to some anonymous influential woman. Going on, love her so she may rescue you. Cherish her so she may exalt you. She will honor you if you embrace her. She will place a gracious garland on your head. A beautiful crown will she bestow on you. The poet will again cloak his remarks with anonymity when referring to the wise woman in the first influential poem down in cycle 2. And at that point it will be poem number 8, beginning with chapter 6, verse 20. Thus, poem number 1, that is, Proverbs 4, 1 through 9, appears to have been designed to preview 3 aspects. First, it employs each of the 3 themes of reprimand, body behavior, and influential women. Second, it introduces those themes in the same sequence as they will subsequently appear, expanded, when we reach cycles 1 and 2. Third, the amount of attention given to each successive theme steadily increases in that introductory poem, just as that length of treatment will steadily increase in cycle 2. We derive this based on the number of independent poems they're devoted to each theme. In these 3 ways, the introduction of poem number 1 mirrors what will follow in cycle 1 and cycle 2 to a remarkable degree. In similar fashion, all 3 themes appear in the closing poem, that is poem number 11, spanning Proverbs chapter 9. The notion of reprimand, that is theme A, figures prominently in Lady Wisdom's instruction to her trainees. Notice especially chapter 9, verses 7 through 9. Here, she does not so much reprimand her disciples, but rather coaches them so they in turn may know when to issue a reprimand and when to withhold it from those that they are subsequently training. Incidentally, we see this same shift where the coach begins to train other coaches in Proverbs 27, beginning in verse 11. That again has to do with reprimand. Verbs and nouns for reproof appear 3 times in these verses of Proverbs 9. The notion next of body parts, that is theme B, is represented in the concluding poem number 11 by the term mind, just as it was in poem 1. Here in poem 11, it's rendered by the translation sense in the expression lacking sense, 9:4 and 9:16. This is the only body part appearing in poem 11. If the grandfather wished to include only one body part as token of this theme B, body parts, the term mind would offer the most vital candidate. The notion of influential women, that is theme C, looms very large in poem number 11. So large, in fact, that one may be inclined to group poem 11 together with the influential women poems that just preceded, 8, 9, and 10. However, in view of the way in which these 3 themes, reprimand, body parts, and then influential women, In view of the way that these three themes systematically unfold across poems number 1 through number 10, with ever-increasing space and intensity, when at last we encounter all three themes artfully combined in a showdown-styled challenge laid before the youth here in Poem 11, it seems clear that Poem 11 does not merely add one more to the series of influential women theme poems of 8, 9, and 10. Rather, Poem 11, here in Proverbs 9, stands on its own as a highly sophisticated closural composition. Its challenge brings to bear on the youth the compounded rhetorical stratagems of all the grandfather's previous compositions, starting way back in Proverbs 4. And now we come to point 4, progression of thought in Proverbs 4 through 9. Our earlier exploration, first of the boundaries of the grandfather's teaching, then themes lending cohesion, and third, thematic patterning. These together enable one now to explore the progression of thought across Proverbs 4 through 9. Tracing the three themes uppermost in the grandfather's mind, that is, reprimand, body behavior, and influential women, this offers the simplest means for such an exploration. A fourth theme, involving life and its antithesis, death, will prove instructive as well, since the poet introduces this fourth theme at those points when he seeks to emphasize the high-stakes nature of choosing between wisdom and folly. Consider first of all then poem number 1, the introduction, entitled Above All Else, Acquire Wisdom, beginning in Proverbs 4 with verse 1. Let's consider now these three themes of body behavior, influential women, and reprimand, and also note where the theme of life or death occurs in, first of all, poem number 1. We noted earlier that the theme of reprimand appears in the term discipline at the outset of this poem. Chapter 4, verse 1, listen, my sons, to a father's discipline. Receptivity to reprimand will, more than anything else, demonstrate that the youth is positioning himself to secure maximum advantage from wisdom. If instead the youth balks at reprimand, wisdom can produce only superficial benefit. What about body behavior? The term mind appropriately inaugurates the theme of body behavior in poem number 1. It appears in the very first phrase of the grandfather's teaching, chapter 4, verse 4, may your mind lay hold of my words. What about the theme of influential women? This theme operates implicitly in this initial poem, without yet naming woman wisdom as such. Already the poet urges a reciprocal relationship wherein the youth loves, esteems, and embraces wisdom, and she, referred to by the anonymous pronoun, she rewards the youth with prestige. This appears in verses 6 to 9 of Proverbs 4. Such a subtle association of women with the feminine flows easily in Hebrew, since, like other abstract nouns, wisdom in Hebrew is in fact a feminine noun. The theme of life appears early on as a verb, providing the sole incentive for the grandfather's summons. Guard my commands forms his summons, and then comes his imperative, and live. That's verse 4b. Pursuit of wisdom entails no less than a life and death matter. Either through wisdom the youth will attain a life lived to the fullest, or failing that, folly will deliver him to death in a most shameful and degrading manner. Let's summarize what we've seen concerning progression of thought, beginning in poem number 1. Amid these artfully interwoven themes lies the core message of this introductory poem, so often repeated and with such bare simplicity as to risk that the reader may discount this composition as something inane, rather than being impacted by its actual tone of desperate urgency. The central thrust of poem number 1 may be paraphrased as follows. If, my son, you were to acquire nothing else in all of life, do your utmost to acquire wisdom. Thereby you will gain life itself. As noted earlier, in poem number 1, the sequence and extent of space devoted to the primary 3 themes, that is, reprimand, body behavior, and influential women, it creates with remarkable precision a preview of cycles 2 and 3. Thus, poem number 1 comprises a rhetorical introduction of the first order. Next we come to poem number 2, which concentrates on theme A, reprimand. It's entitled, Cling to the Route of Discipline by Exiting the Route of the Guilty. It begins in Proverbs 4:10. Poem number 2 opens cycle 1, which is a theme-sequenced group of 3 poems. The theme of reprimand forms the focal message here of poem number 2. Reprimand unfolds in 3 ways. First, note the imperatives, calling the youth to quit his current misguided course, replacing it with another direction instead. And that shows up in chapter 4, verses 14 and 15. This portion constitutes one of 2 actual instances of reprimand in Proverbs 4-9. The other one will appear in poem number 5. Second, in the verse prior to the actual reprimand content of 4:14 and 15, the sage issues an instruction reinforcing the concept of reprimand. So in 4:13 he says, take hold of discipline, don't let go. As later usage will demonstrate, the term discipline in the grandfather's vocabulary connotes reprimand, not heroic resolve in the face of difficulty, like the discipline of an athlete. A third evidence of reprimand in poem 2 arises from the indications that the current negative directives are not new. The grandfather has delivered this cautionary counsel before. This is evident from his recollection, where in chapter 4, verse 11, he says, in the way of wisdom I have instructed you. The pupil knows quite well which path he ought to have traveled. Sadly, he chose wrongly in the past, and so earns a reprimand now designed to get him back on track. What of the theme of body behavior? In poem 2, this theme is absent. Such an omission suits a poem that is in fact designed to showcase the theme of reprimand. What of the theme of influential women? This appears only obliquely in poem number 2, just as it did in poem 1. A feminine character is implied when the youth is urged, protect her, for she is your life. Chapter 4, verse 13b. Since the immediate antecedent, discipline, in that verse is masculine, this feminine pronoun she, in the expression she is your life, must recall similar use of feminine pronouns referring more generally to wisdom, which is feminine, such as we found taking place in the composition of poem 1. What about the theme of life, or its antithesis, death? As with the grandfather's summons to his opening teaching, 4:4 read, guard my commands and live. So again here in poem 2, the theme of life appears at the close of the summons. Listen, my son, take my words, so they may multiply for you years of life. That's chapter 4, verse 10. And consider this from verse 13. Of even greater impact is the way that the positive section of the poem opens by equating reprimand with life itself. Hear this exclamation then in verse 13. Protect it, and that refers back to discipline, for she is your life. How shall we summarize then the progression of thought reflected in poem 2? Within the larger context of Proverbs 4-9, poem 2, that is the opening poem of Cycle 1, that trio of poems, it makes its greatest contribution as an actual instance of reprimand. Although this poem contains multiple expressions dealing with the motif of journey, that rather serves as the context. The sage's focal message actually concentrates on reprimand. Due to past instruction which the grandfather had provided, the youth was quite aware which route was the right one to choose. However, he now finds himself traveling along the wrong way and thus needs the shock of reprimand in order, hopefully, to find his way back before recovery becomes impossible. And now let's move to poem number 3. Poem 3 concentrates on theme B, that is body behavior. We may entitle it this way: For life and health, train your body in forthright behaviors. Proverbs 4, beginning with verse 20. Although poem 3 contains a high quotient of commands, whether in the summons or in the core of the poem, they do not actually entail the theme of reprimand. They do not explicitly fault the youth for having failed on some point. So reprimand does not qualify as the central theme for poem 3. Instead, the theme of body behavior forms the central focal motif in this poem. The general notion of the human body begins as early as the summons opening verse, which refers to eyes and to mind. We're referring here to chapter 4, verse 21. The theme concludes the summons itself with an unusual incentive, intensified by a summation that encompasses the whole body. The teacher's words will bring life and, quote, for one's entire flesh, healing. That's from chapter 4, verse 22, closing the summons. After that point, the grandfather proceeds to list 6 body parts, one after the other, coupled with a behavior recommended uniquely for each part. That begins in 4:23. The mind earns first position since all of life's initiatives spring out of it. Safeguarding identifies the proper way to treat one's mind. The behavior appropriate to subsequent body parts involves directing or steering them. With a wide range of terms from the journey motif, these body parts must be channeled in various ways. They must be made to veer far from something, or to proceed straight ahead, or to level smoothly, or to keep back from the twisted, keep back from the right, from the left, or from the wrong. Through all these movements, the mind reigns as supreme controller. No wonder, then, the mind identifies the locus where instruction must be safeguarded, 4:21. Compare on this 6:21 and 7:3. This pivotal role of the mind will receive additional emphasis in later poems. Thus, for example, when a reprimand falls unheeded, the fault lies with the mind, 5:12. Consequently, it only stands to reason that one must beware when the mind begins to succumb to treacherous appeals. That will show up in 7:25. Simply put, those persons who blunder into the worst of catastrophes are senseless, literally lacking mind. We see this in 6:32 and 7:7. Fortunately, they are not without hope, for Lady Wisdom's hospitable offer will extend even to them, provided they will part with naivete. And this is in chapter 9, beginning in verse 4. Body behavior will return in cycle 2 of Proverbs 4-9, dominating in particular poems number 6 and number 7. When those later poems are viewed alongside our current poem number 3, one observes that this first poem presents positive behavior, how one who travels the way of wisdom ought to behave. In contrast, poems 6 and 7 present negative behaviors that proceed from bad to worse. Poem number 6 describes the mouth, eyes, feet, fingers, and mind of the worthless fellow. This escalates in poem number 7 to a description of the eyes, tongue, hands, mind, and feet of one who is just patently detestable to the Lord. What about the theme of influential women within poem number 3? Frankly, it does not appear. This omission allows undiluted focus on the primary motif, namely body behavior. For the third consecutive time, a promise of life serves as incentive to a summons. We're referring here to Proverbs 4:22. The other two instances were 4:4 and 4:10. Further, in the following verse, we learn why protecting one's mind is so important. Verse 23 indicates that unguarded, the mind may fall captive, forfeiting its capacity to produce vivifying initiatives. How then can we summarize the sense of progression of thought in poem number 3? To this point, the grandfather has presented an endorsement of wisdom, an endorsement that was emphatic and yet fairly general. We're referring here to poem number 1. Thereafter, he lodged a reprimand calculated to divert the youth from some undisclosed wrong route. That was poem number 2. Exactly what is wrong with that route or how the youth arrived there remains unclear. We only know that he has taken up travel with companions who are inveterate perpetrators of violence. Chapter 4, verses 16 and 17 indicate that. Now, here in the third poem, the grandfather dispenses with such generalities, outlining instead the particular corrective behavior that is needed. This teacher of Israel would differ sharply with any Gnostic-styled notion which excused misbehavior in one's body, claiming instead that only the spirit mattered. No, the way of life which this grandfather calls for will be linked inextricably to how one behaves in one's body. And it is alike in the body that one may expect reward. Chapter 4, verse 22 reads, "And for one's entire flesh, there is healing." The emphasis on body behavior will not end with this poem. As we noted earlier, the sage will return to the motif of body behavior in 2 more poems within Cycle 2, poems number 6 and 7. As close as are the connections joining poems 3, 6, and 7, and those are the 3 body behavior themed poems, we miss the powerful subtlety of the body behavior theme if we limit our attention only to these 3. Consider, for example, the very next poem, which is the last in Cycle 1. It will warn of the youth's demise. If he will not heed reprimand, he will fall prey to certain captivity, a captivity brought about when, despite his own efforts, he becomes overpowered by another's seductive use of her body. That is poem number 4, encompassing chapter 5. In the next portion of this video, we'll examine progression of thought in poem number 4.